Why a 100mm gun couldn't penetrate the Panther's front? Secrets of the USSR's legendary self-propelled gun. On March 12, 1945, the Hungarian soil shook from the roar of 60 German tanks that moved to attack Soviet positions at dawn. The 2011th Self-Propelled Artillery Regiment, armed with the latest SU-100 machines, took up defensive positions and prepared for battle. The crews were confident in their vehicles, as the command had promised them the best anti-tank self-propelled gun in the Red Army. In a few hours, only 3 combat-ready machines would remain of the regiment, while 18 self-propelled guns would turn into charred heaps of metal. This was the first serious battle for the SU-100, and it ended in a catastrophe that people would later try to forget. But to understand why this happened, one must go back a year and a half, when this machine was only being born in design bureaus and on factory floors. On November 11, 1943, the People's Commissariat of Armament issued an order to develop a new 100mm self-propelled gun. The Red Army was in dire need of a powerful anti-tank weapon capable of hitting heavy German armored vehicles at long distances. The existing SU-85 was no longer coping with the increased protection of enemy machines, and the front required something more serious. On December 27th of the same year, the State Defense Committee decreed to arm a medium self-propelled gun with a 100mm weapon. A race began between 2 design teams for the right to create a new weapon of victory. Initially, it was planned to use the S-34 gun developed by Gorlitsky's design group. However, when attempting to install this weapon into the hull of the self-propelled gun, serious layout problems arose. The gun simply did not fit into the dimensions of the fighting compartment, and the engineers could not achieve an acceptable placement for the crew. At this time, a competing project with the D-10S gun, created in the design bureau of the legendary Vasily Grabin, broke ahead. His gun turned out to be more successful in size and fit significantly better into the Su-85 hull, on the basis of which the new machine was being created. Uralmashzavod, together with Plant No. 50, produced the first prototype with Grabin's gun in February 1944. From March 9th to 27th, state trials of the new self-propelled gun took place at the Gorokovets range. The machine covered 864 kilometers over cross-country terrain and fired 1,040 shots from its powerful gun. The commission was satisfied with the results and recommended accepting the self-propelled gun for service after eliminating the identified defects. It seemed the path to mass production was open. However, Gorlitsky's group was not going to give up without a fight. The designers insisted that their prototype, the SU-102, also undergo testing. In June and July of '44, comparative firing trials of both machines took place. The self-propelled gun with Grabin's gun again confirmed its superiority in all key parameters, and on July 3, 1944, the SU-100 was officially accepted into service with the Red Army. But these bureaucratic delays and design rivalries cost precious time. Mass production of the new self-propelled gun began only in September of '44, which was almost a year after the first development order. In war, such a period can cost thousands of lives and hundreds of lost battles. And this was not the only problem, as a machine without shells is merely a useless pile of metal. Mass production of 100mm armor-piercing ammunition began only in October 1944. Su-100 units began arriving at the troops in November, but stood idle until January of '45, waiting for shells for their mighty guns. Crews underwent training and studied the new equipment, but could not even conduct full-scale training firing due to the acute shortage of ammunition. The front was waiting for a wonder weapon, while it was gathering dust in the rear. The first real battles for the Su-100 were seen only near Budapest and in the area between Lakes Balaton and Velence. By this time, the war was already relentlessly rolling toward its conclusion, and the new self-propelled gun had very little time left to prove itself. The question was whether it could justify the hopes placed upon it or would become another disappointment for Soviet tank crews who were already used to their machines being inferior to German heavy tanks in duels. The SU-100 compared favorably with its predecessor, the SU-85, in several important parameters at once. Designers installed improved observation devices on the new machine, which allowed the crew to orient themselves better on the battlefield and detect targets faster. Sighting devices also underwent modernization and provided more accurate shooting at long distances. They significantly improved the ventilation of the fighting compartment, which was critically important during intensive firing when powder gases quickly filled the enclosed space of the self-propelled gun and could incapacitate the entire crew. However, there were two main differences, and it was these that determined the combat value of the new machine. The first was a significantly more powerful D-10S gun of 100mm caliber instead of the previous 85. The second difference concerned the armor of the front part of the hull, which was increased to 75mm versus 45 on the SU-85. Theoretically, the new self-propelled gun should have protected the crew better and hit enemy equipment more effectively. But along with the advantages came serious disadvantages that did not appear immediately. The huge driver's hatch was located right on the front armor and represented a blatant weakness in the vehicle's protection. This was a real hole in the armored shield that never went anywhere during the transition from the SU-85 to the new model. The designers perfectly understood this problem, but they never managed to find a successful solution. The large 100mm gun required serious changes in the layout of the fighting compartment. The workplace of the vehicle commander had to be pushed far to the starboard side, and as a result, a so-called shot trap was formed. This projection was covered by armor only 45mm thick, and enemy shells, hitting this zone, easily pierced the protection. German gunners quickly learned to aim specifically at this vulnerable spot. It would seem that the powerful gun and increased armor should have made the SU-100 a formidable opponent for any German equipment. In practice, problems of a completely different nature arose. The large overhang of the heavy gun barrel made the machine clumsy and unmaneuverable. The front part of the self-propelled gun was so overloaded that the first two road wheels experienced colossal loads for which they were not originally designed. The wheels did not just wear out quickly, but literally disintegrated during operation. The weld seams could not withstand the constant tension and began to crack. Cracks appeared on the armor plates, and not as a result of enemy fire, but simply from driving over cross-country terrain. The machine seemed to fall apart by itself, even before it entered battle with the enemy. Repair crews were run off their feet trying to maintain the self-propelled guns in combat-ready condition. Serious problems also arose with the gearbox, which could not cope with the increased mass of the machine. The vertical guidance mechanism of the gun also worked sporadically, which critically affected shooting accuracy. Sighting devices, despite all improvements, periodically failed at the most inopportune moment. The heavy gun required significant effort during aiming, and the gunners quickly tired during intense combat. Designers and factory engineers tried as best they could to eliminate the identified defects. Changes were made to the design of the chassis, welded joints were reinforced, and guidance mechanisms were refined. However, it was never possible to completely get rid of all the teething problems of the new machine until the very end of the war. Crews had to fight on equipment that required constant attention and careful handling, which was practically impossible to provide in combat conditions. The main advantage of the SU-100 remained its D-10S gun, for the sake of which the entire machine was created. The basic load was only 33 shots, which was noticeably less than that of its predecessor. However, each shell carried a significantly greater destructive power. During the Second World War, there were two types of armor-piercing shells for this gun: the BR-412 and BR-412B, each of which possessed impressive armor penetration characteristics. At an impact angle of 90 degrees, that is, when hitting strictly perpendicular to the armor plate, these shells demonstrated impressive results. However, in real combat, such ideal conditions were practically never met. Enemy tanks, as a rule, were at a certain aspect angled to the firing self-propelled gun, which significantly reduced the effectiveness of armor-piercing ammunition. Therefore, artillerymen always oriented themselves toward the indicators at an angle of 60 degrees, which gave a more realistic picture of the gun's capabilities. And this is where the most interesting part began, because on paper, the 100mm gun looked like a real tank killer. But reality turned out to be significantly more complex and unpleasant for Soviet self-propelled gunners. Against medium German machines, the D-10S gun indeed worked excellently. The Panzer IV had front hull armor 80mm thick, which at a typical aspect angle of 30 degrees gave a nominal protection of about 92mm. SU-100 shells pierced such armor from a distance of more than 2 kilometers, allowing these tanks to be destroyed long before they could effectively respond. The turret of the Panzer IV with its 50mm front armor was hit from almost 3 kilometers away. The Stu-G assault gun represented roughly the same target. Its 80mm front armor at an aspect angle turned into a nominal 92mm, and the Soviet self-propelled gun's 100mm weapon confidently handled this opponent at long distances. It would seem the SU-100 received exactly the weapon needed to fight German armor. The Tiger heavy tank at first glance also did not present an insurmountable problem. Its front hull armor was 100mm at an inclination angle of only 8 degrees, which gave a nominal protection of about 101mm. At a standard aspect angle, the value increased to 116mm, and the SU-100 could hit the Tiger in the hull from a distance of almost 2 kilometers. These are good indicators for a self-propelled gun that weighed significantly less than its opponent. However, with the Tiger's turret, the situation was significantly more complicated. The front part was covered by a massive gun mantlet of complex shape, and the thickness of the armor in this zone varied from 90 to 200mm, depending on the specific mantlet variant. A hit to the turret turned into a real lottery, where the result depended not so much on the gunner's skill, but on pure luck. A shell could pierce the protection or ricochet off a thicker section. In any case, by the time mass production of the SU-100 began, the Tiger was already leaving the stage. The Germans stopped its production a month before the Soviet self-propelled gun went into series. When the SU-100 finally entered battle, this once formidable tank was already considered obsolete, and the German command even handed over the remaining machines to the Hungarian army. The Tiger ceased to be a priority target. The real headache became the Panther, which by that time formed the basis of German tank units. The front armor of its hull was 80mm thick, but was positioned at an angle of 55 degrees. This slope radically changed the situation, turning 80mm into a nominal 139. At an aspect angle, the protection increased to 161mm, and here, the most unpleasant part for Soviet self-propelled gunners began. The D-10S gun could not pierce the front of the Panther's hull even from 500 meters. The large margin of durability of German armor meant that even at close distances, where the battle turned into a deadly struggle, SU-100 shells were powerless against this target. Soviet crews had to look for other vulnerable spots or hope for a lucky set of circumstances. The cast gun mantlet of the Panther was 110mm thick, but cast armor is roughly 10 to 15% weaker than rolled armor, which gave a nominal 90mm. At an aspect angle, it was about 104mm, and theoretically, the SU-100 could hit the mantlet from a distance of just under 2 kilometers. However, the mantlet had a rounded shape, and 104mm were obtained only with an ideal hit in the center. A shell that went slightly higher or lower met significantly thicker armor. The front of the Panther's turret, 80 millimeters thick at a 12-degree slope, was pierced from 1.5 kilometers or more, but the turret represented a relatively small and mobile target. In real combat conditions, hitting it from such a distance was extremely difficult, especially considering that the Panther at this time returned fire from its accurate and long-range gun. The King Tiger was completely invulnerable to 100-millimeter shells. Its front armor could not be pierced under any circumstances, and an encounter with this machine promised serious trouble for Soviet self-propelled gunners. Fortunately, relatively few King Tigers were produced, and the chance of encountering them in battle remained small. There was another important factor that was rarely considered in tabular data. German armor was heterogeneous, with a hard face layer, in contrast to homogeneous armor, which is uniform throughout its thickness. Upon hitting such protection, shells behaved unpredictably, more often ricocheting or losing the head part responsible for armor penetration. The real resistance of German armor turned out to be higher than the figures indicated in handbooks. A paradoxical situation resulted. The mighty 100-millimeter gun, which because of its large dimensions and weight could not be installed in any Soviet tank and was placed with difficulty in a self-propelled gun, did not even reach the armor penetration of the Panther's 75-millimeter gun. The German medium tank could confidently hit the SU-100, while the Soviet self-propelled gun was powerless against its front armor. Now let's see how things stood with the protection of the SU-100 itself. The front armor, 75 millimeters thick, was positioned at a significant angle of inclination, which gave a nominal protection of about 98 millimeters of vertical armor. At an aspect angle of 30 degrees, this value increased to 113.5 millimeters. These were good indicators for a medium self-propelled gun, but how did they correlate with the capabilities of German weapons? The Panzer IV and Stu-G3, with their short and long 75-millimeter guns, could not pierce the front armor of the SU-100 even from 100 meters. This gave Soviet self-propelled gunners a significant advantage when meeting the bulk of German armored vehicles. However, it was too early to rejoice, as there were plenty of more dangerous opponents on the battlefield. The Tiger, with its famous 88-millimeter gun, pierced the front of the SU-100 from a distance of 1,600 to 1,700 meters. The Panther managed this task from about 1,800 meters, and the King Tiger confidently hit the Soviet self-propelled gun from a distance of more than 2 kilometers. It turned out that the SU-100 could effectively fight only against medium German machines, when it was enough for the gunner to simply hit the silhouette of the enemy tank. Against equipment of the Panther's level, success no longer depended on the power of the gun, but on how advantageous a position the crew of the self-propelled gun managed to take, or how unsuccessfully the German driver turned his machine. Tactical skill and combat luck began to play a larger role than technical characteristics. The Germans knew this perfectly well, as they captured SU-100 units in battles and carefully studied the trophy machines. German specialists noted the increased armor penetration of the new Soviet weapon compared to previous models. But unlike the first T-34 and KV tanks, which made a shocking impression on the Germans in '41, the new self-propelled gun did not particularly impress them. They understood the strengths and weaknesses of the SU-100 and knew how to fight it. The 207th Self-Propelled Artillery Brigade received its machines and arrived in Hungary to take part in the concluding battles in this direction. By the start of combat operations, the brigade had 62 SU-100 units, organized into 2 regiments, the 912th and the 2011th. The crews had undergone training and were eager to test the new equipment in action. On March 12, 1945, the enemy, with forces of up to 60 tanks supported by an infantry regiment, went on the offensive. The attack began at 8:30 in the morning, and according to the brigade's combat log, all enemy strikes were repelled with heavy losses for the Germans. However, behind this dry wording lay a completely different story. The Soviet defense in this sector was extremely dense. Besides 2 regiments of SU-100, there were 2 regiments of anti-tank guns, 18 T-34-85 tanks, and infantry units. Minefields were laid in front of the positions, which were supposed to delay and bleed the attacking enemy. It seemed impossible to break through such a defense. The Germans managed to make a gap in the mine obstacles, and the Soviet infantry fled. Moreover, they fled so quickly that the soldiers didn't even have time to feel the support of their anti-tank cover. The main blow fell on the 2011th Self-Propelled Artillery Regiment, which took the fight practically alone. The neighboring 912th Regiment tried to help its dying comrades, but its efforts proved unsuccessful. The regiment was almost completely destroyed in this battle. Of the entire strength, only 3 combat-ready machines survived. The rest turned into blazing bonfires on Hungarian soil. According to the brigade's combat log, 18 SU units were knocked out in the 2011th Regiment, and 3 more in the 912th. In one day, the brigade lost 21 self-propelled guns irrecoverably, and 1 more machine was sent for repair with a shot-off commander's cupola. This was a terrible blow, as the brigade lost a third of its strength in the very first serious encounter. The Germans did not advance further, but the price of stopping their offensive turned out to be extremely high. On March 13th, the 509th Heavy Tank Battalion of the Wehrmacht irrecoverably lost 3 King Tigers. German documents indicated that the machines were destroyed by fire from SU-152 units. However, they were most likely hit by the SU-100 units from the 207th Brigade. A certain confusion remains in the dates and circumstances of this battle, but the Germans recorded the fact of losing 3 heavy tanks themselves. Subsequent days brought new clashes and new losses. On March 18th, the Self-Propelled Artillery Regiment repelled further German tank attacks. According to Soviet reports, they managed to knock out 1 Tiger and 3 Panzer IV units in this battle. The regiment's losses were 4 SU-100 machines. That is, Soviet losses in defense turned out to be equal to the claimed German losses in the offensive, and this despite the fact that in addition to the self-propelled guns, other units also fired at the enemy. However, an interesting story arose with the claimed Tigers. In the 3rd Tank Regiment of the 3rd Tank Division Totenkopf, which was part of the 4th SS Tank Corps, there were only 7 Tigers at that time. According to German documents on March 18th, this regiment did not lose a single machine of this type. The Tigers could have gotten into the Soviet statistics in 2 ways. Either they were invented to somehow explain the loss of 4 of their own burned self-propelled guns, or completely different machines were mistaken for Tigers. On March 19th, the battles continued. 1 SU blew up on a mine, but the regiment claimed the destruction of 1 King Tiger and 3 regular Tigers. Another Tiger was recorded as knocked out. Impressive results for one day, if not for one circumstance. The same 7 Tigers were still listed in the 3rd Tank Regiment, and on that day, they were retreating to the town of Moore and suffered no losses. With the King Tiger, the situation turned out to be even more interesting. The 509th Heavy Tank Battalion was busy that day evacuating broken-down machines and also had no combat losses. But in the 501st SS Heavy Tank Battalion, crews themselves blew up several of their King Tigers due to the lack of evacuation means. These machines, abandoned and blown up by their own crews, could well have been recorded by the Soviet side as destroyed in battle. On March 20th, the 207th Brigade went on the offensive. At the end of the day, records appeared in the documents about 5 burned Tigers, 1 Panzer IV, 1 repainted T-34, 1 British Churchill tank, and 1 Panther. Own losses were 1 burned SU-100. I don't even want to analyze the claimed Tigers in detail, so obvious becomes the discrepancy between Soviet reports and the real state of affairs. On March 21st, the brigade claimed 14 burned German tanks and 6 knocked out. Own losses again were 1 burned self-propelled gun and 4 knocked out. Day after day, the reports were full of impressive figures of destroyed enemy equipment. However, checking against German documents time and again revealed significant discrepancies. In total, from March 11th to April 15th, 1945, the 207th Brigade claimed the destruction of 113 tanks and self-propelled mounts of the enemy. 13 knocked-out tanks went as a separate line. Own irrecoverable losses for this period were 42 SU-100 units. By mid-April, 17 machines remained in service. Another one was undergoing major repairs. Regarding the 126 claimed knocked out and destroyed German tanks, serious doubts arise. Often those same machines that German crews blew up themselves due to a lack of spare parts or fuel were recorded in Soviet reports as destroyed in battle. Establishing the real level of exaggerations today is already extremely difficult. It is a thankless task requiring painstaking comparison of documents from both sides. It is important to understand the context of those events. By the spring of '45, the German war economy was in a state of complete collapse. Inspector General of Armored Troops Heinz Guderian later recounted that the command persuaded Hitler not to increase the production of new tanks, but to provide spare parts for existing ones. This never happened. Due to the acute shortage of fuel, Wehrmacht armored vehicles simply could not perform the necessary movements between sectors of the front. In cases of even minor breakdowns that were easily fixed in field conditions, tanks and self-propelled guns became irrecoverable losses. Left without fuel and spare parts, machines were massively blown up by their own crews. Entire units disappeared with minimal combat losses. One should not naively believe that the high losses of German armor in Hungary were the result of the appearance of the mighty SU-100. Documents testify to a completely different picture. The German war machine was falling apart from the inside, and in many cases, Soviet troops only had to record the results of this disintegration. After the end of the Second World War, the SU-100 continued its service. From 1944 to 1956, 4,976 machines of this type were produced. As a result of Soviet deliveries and subsequent re-export, the self-propelled guns reached Algeria, North Korea, Morocco, Vietnam, Yemen, Albania, Angola, Bulgaria, China, Cuba, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Egypt, Hungary, Iraq, Mongolia, Poland, Romania, Syria, and Yugoslavia. They served everywhere, and in some places, they even fought. A famous photograph captured Fidel Castro on the armor of an SU-100 during the repulse of the invasion at the Bay of Pigs. Later, this specific machine became a monument in Cuba. But the most intense combat use after '45 awaited these self-propelled guns in the Arab-Israeli wars, where they fought against completely different opponents. If you liked this story, be sure to give it a like and subscribe to the channel so as not to miss new episodes. Write in the comments which equipment you would like to learn about next time. Your opinion is very important for the development of the channel.